Hi folks, good afternoon and thanks for coming out. It's really a pleasure to talk about this work, this really enjoyable conference in this lovely location. My only complaint about the conference, which some of you may have experienced too, is my room overlooks a section of the Riverwalk where the most insipid form of pan flute music is on constantly, including songs by Journey, which was kind of so fortunately we won't be distracted by that here. So I'm going to be talking about joint work with Jim Wyckoff, who's here, and I appreciate you coming out to hear this. So the motivation here is going to be one that's very familiar to people in this room. There's this growing research consensus about the importance of teacher quality. One off-cited result is the Chetty et al. One that replacing a bottom 5% teacher with an average teacher increases the present discounted value of lifetime income for people in that classroom by about $250,000. And of course, as many of us know, most easily observed traits don't predict that teacher quality very well. So the broad kind of meta debate here is how can we drive systematic improvements in teacher quality to improve student outcomes. Now we're going to focus on one part of that, but we want to remember it's part of this broader debate that includes rethinking how we do teacher training, rethinking what kind of pathways allow people to get into the teaching profession, and also thinking about how do we improve the performance of extant teachers through professional development, an important topic about which I think we know embarrassingly little. But the more narrow focus for today's talk is going to involve teacher assessment and compensation reforms, and as many of you know, currently teacher pay is based on rigid salary schedules that reward experience and graduate degrees. And assessments of teacher performance tend to be perfunctory, low-stakes affairs, so-called drive-by assessments that generally have no meaningful implications and very little variance in how teacher performance is measured. And this is also in a setting where there's been a diffusion of a lot of innovative reforms around evaluating and reforming teachers. So many of you are familiar with the activities going on under Race to the Top, TIF, school improvement grants, and now NCLB waivers. And it's my sense from observing this unfold that it kind of seems as if it's almost on a razor's edge right now, where there's this kind of fitful and uncertain implementation. So for example, several big urban TIF awardees recently had to return their TIF grants because they couldn't secure buy-in from the teachers union. So that was millions of dollars that had to be returned to the federal government. What we're anecdotally hearing about school turnaround activity under school improvement grants is that there's a slow implementation of performance-based compensation for teachers. Secretary Duncan recently had to announce that states with NCLB waivers would be given an additional year to roll out their teacher evaluation systems. And also, we're also hearing, particularly from critics of these types of pilots, that this is really being complicated. Assessing teacher performance is deeply complicated by the simultaneously rollout of entirely new and unevenly supported assessment systems, the Common Core. So I think it's interesting to bear that in mind. But then we also want to think about, well, does the research evidence that already exists provide any guidance? And I'm going to brush over this just in the interest of time, and I suspect many of you are familiar with this literature. There have been several recent cash for test score experiments that have mostly produced null results. And so the question then is, how do we understand that body of null results? And I haven't seen much of that discussed formally, but just informally discussing it at conferences like this, I've heard people put forward a number of hypotheses. One is that, look, teachers are already highly motivated, and there's going to be a small marginal product from giving them further incentives. Another complaint you sometimes hear about these experiments, well, is that maybe they set the test score targets too high to motivate teachers, or because they were group incentives instead of individually targeted incentives, they might have been weakly powered. Another point that we make in the paper is there's a body of evidence from economics that the effects of incentives are going to be muted when they're linked to an outcome that people don't necessarily see as effort responsive. They may want to earn the reward, but how do they go about doing it? And that may be an issue with test scores. I mean, if you're a teacher and you're given incentives for raising test scores, you may think, well, that's nice, but what do I do in my classroom tomorrow and the next day and the day after that? That's going to clearly map into a stronger probability of me receiving that award. So again, if teachers don't perceive that, incentives aren't really going to move the needle on key outcomes. Now, another thing I've heard people discuss is it has to do with the stock of teachers that we currently have in the field. I've heard people make claims that extant teachers lack the capacity or willingness to respond to incentives. And that leads some people to argue you need to couple these incentives with better teacher supports, or that instead of looking at the performance of extant teachers, we need to also be thinking about differential recruitment into the profession. And that's part of the paper we'll be talking about today. So what is that paper? Well, we think there are some pretty unique insights from the impact system that was introduced in DC public schools. So if you're not familiar with it, it's a very high profile, very ambitious performance assessment system that started assessing teachers with the 2009-10 school year. And I'm going to describe its components in a little bit of detail, but basically the way it was set up is teachers were evaluated on multiple measures and then received an overall score that ranged from 100 to 400. And the implications of that depended on where their score placed them in these four bands. So in the lower band, ineffective teachers with scores below 175, they were immediately dismissed. The kind of Orwellian euphemism the district uses is you're separated from the district. And fewer than 4% of teachers fell in that bin. The next bin is minimally effective, and teachers in this bin were essentially told, you need to become effective within the next year or you will be separated. Teachers in the effective range from 250 to 349 essentially had business as usual, and teachers 350 and above were given a substantial cash bonus immediately, but then interestingly told, if you can crush it a second time, if you can be highly effective for a second consecutive year, we'll give you a permanent base salary increase, whose present discounted value can actually be quite substantial. So essentially the core of this study is a regression discontinuity analysis of how the incentive contrast that exists around this threshold and around this threshold move both on teacher retention and the performance of teachers who may have returned under this system. So that's the basic structure. Okay, so again, why is we think impact is really unique in light of what we know now? Well, one is, I'm going to stress, the incentives are uniquely high-powered as well as individually targeted. Especially large financial rewards, but also the possibility of dismissal, which may also, is not only a strong incentive, but has this kind of loss aversion feature to it as well. The other thing I think is really critical to underscore is that teacher performance here is based on multiple measures that really privilege classroom observation. And again, if you think you need to incent people to do things they feel they can actually control, that's important. And as I'm going to stress, test scores play a relatively modest role. In many ways, this approach to assessing teachers was quite prescient of what the MET project subsequently argued about effective ways of doing this. And the other thing that kind of surprised us, or at least me, as I got to know this system better, because when first hearing about this impact, you kind of had this image of Michelle Reed running around the district with a bloody hatchet. But as I really kind of got into looking at the details of the program, I was quite impressed by the sophistication of the program and the kind of smart, energetic people who were designing and implementing it. And that included clear communication of the expectations to the teacher workforce, careful training of the raters and the creation of kind of supportive data systems for this program, and also some teacher supports, in particular through an instructional coaching program designed to help teachers meet those expectations. And finally, the fourth thing I'll stress that makes this study kind of exciting is that this is an at-scale system that's been politically tested in the field in a major urban school district, not a temporary small-scale experimental pilot. I want to be careful here because I'm a big fan of doing experiments. I'm a card-carrying randomista. But, one of the things that concerns me about them sometimes is the estimates we get from them may be something of a hothouse flower. When you've got select participants who select to be in a program before random assignment, who are told what the program is about, and then also know the program is temporary, we may not learn about how such a program might influence outcomes in the real world. So having something that is in the real world, coupled with the possibility of as good as random assignment evaluation, and all of these other compelling design features, was uniquely exciting to us. Okay. So a little bit about the impact timelines. I think this is critical to in thinking about some of the heterogeneity we observe across our two study years. So all of this began in the fall of 2006 when Adrian Fenny was elected mayor of DC on a kind of reformist agenda that very clearly included the schools. Upon taking office, he introduced legislation to wrest control of the school district from the board and have mayoral control. the ink was dry on that within 6 months, and he immediately appointed Michelle Rhee as Chancellor of DC Public Schools. And then she immediately started pursuing a very ambitious agenda, dismissing lots of central office staff, dismissing underperforming teachers, etc. It led up, I don't have it in the slides anymore, it led up to that famous fall 2008 Time magazine cover that showed her standing astride a broom, which is one of the most divisive Time covers, I think, ever. And it was after that, actually. In the spring of 2009, she told the council, we're going to introduce this teacher evaluation system. And so during the 9-10 school year, teachers were evaluated on that. In summer of 2010, the first teachers rated as ineffective were fired, and minimally effective teachers were told you're under dismissal threat. Now I put a question mark there because now we're 4 years into Fenty's term, and he's running for re-election. And immediately, and it was kind of clear he might lose, and his opponent was Vincent Gray, a council member who had been a vocal opponent of these kind of reforms. So by September he lost, and by October Michelle Rhee was gone. So one of the things that's a possibility, and of course we don't have definitive evidence on this, but it's possible that in that first year, if you were under a minimally effective threat, you might not have seen that as a really credible threat, now that the architects of that program were no longer in power. Now interestingly, Kaya Henderson, who worked closely with Michelle Rhee, was appointed interim chancellor, and then in the spring, named permanent chancellor. And then something a little surprising happened. The program persisted. In summer of 2011, teachers who'd been rated as ineffective in the 10-11 school year were dismissed, and teachers who had just gotten their second consecutive minimally effective rating were dismissed for the first time. And so our second year of treatment data is for minimally effective teachers who get that minimally effective rating for the first time here, when it's demonstrably true that the threats were, dismissal threats were actually real. Okay, so important to bear that in mind. Let me give you a quick overview of how teacher performance is measured here. That will probably raise as many questions as it answers, but it basically has these key components. The main thing is this classroom observation rubric, where the district defined 9 explicit domains of what it thought constituted effective instruction. Checking for student understanding, differentiating instruction for different types of learners, having well-organized, clearly oriented lessons, etc. And they had 5 classroom observations. Now, interestingly, there were 3 by typically the principal or assistant principal, but then 2 other observations were done by this roving band of district-level master educators who would show up at a school site and sit in on classrooms. And I was going to show you that's the lion's share of how these teachers were evaluated. A small subset of teachers also had their value-added scores as a component of this. Growth on DC's high-stakes test, the CAS, in models that conditioned on student and peer traits. Now, that can only, I'm going to stress, that can only be defined for a subset of teachers. The remaining teachers use student achievement data in a more fluid way, where teachers would choose, and their principals would have to approve, learning goals that were based on non-CAS assessments relevant to their subjects. And at the end of the year, the administrators had a structured rubric for rating how well the teachers met their expectations. Principals also rated teachers in terms of their support of school initiatives, and there was a small component given to the school level value added. So how were they weighted up? Well, general education teachers were divided into group 1 and group 2. Roughly 80% of general education teachers are in group 2. And IPA can't be calculated for them because there aren't pre-post CAS scores for the grades and subjects in which they're teaching. So for those teachers, 75% of their scores on the TLF, with smaller components for the tasks, commitment to school community, and school value added. For the group 1 teachers, who are math teachers in grades 4 through 8, ELA teachers grades 3 through 10, 50% was IBA, 35% was TLF, with the remainder going to the other components. As an aside, my understanding is this has now dropped to 35%, and TLF has increased, but that's outside our study window. Another interesting component is, once a score was determined, principal could dock a teacher's score if they failed to demonstrate professionalism. And then the logic here was they expect every teacher to be professional. You're not going to get extra points for doing that. But if you fail to meet those expectations, they're going to take away 10 to 40 points. Okay, so did it work? Well, this is a graph that the DC people sometimes show, which are CAS scores across the different wards in DC between 2010 and 13. And you see growth across the district there. But that's a high-stakes test, so you should be cynical of that. Last fall, we saw the most recent NAEP scores, low-stakes tests, showing dramatic improvement. But again, I think everyone in this room is and should be suspicious of that. There are lots of candidate explanations for those sorts of pre-post comparisons. Other district reforms, general trends in the district, and also the churn in a kind of robust charter sector. So again, we're trying to construct credibly causal evidence on these impact mechanisms through an RD design that leverages the incentive contrast at those thresholds. The dismissal threat for those just below 250, and the opportunity for that permanent pay increase for those above. And we calculated that could have a present value close to $200,000 for a younger teacher who has a BA, is not yet in the graduate band, and is in a high poverty school. So really unusually large financial incentives. Now I'm going to run short on time, so I'm going to try to move a little more quickly. With the impact data, we've got teacher level data for these general education teachers who were scored on 9, 10, 10, 11 performance, and our outcomes are retention and performance in the next year, so 10, 11, and 11, 12. We've got a bunch of conventional covariates, and we can condition on school fixed effects in these specifications. For the analysis around MEE margin, again, we're using your initial impact score as the forcing variable, and we've got about 2,000 observations. In the second year, we have 2010-11 teachers who were not ME in the previous year. Because if you were ME in the previous year, in the second year, there's just going to be a mechanical effect on retention, because you were forcibly separated, right? And we want to isolate the voluntary mechanism, so we exclude them. If we include them, the effect looks even bigger, but reflects two different channels. And we've got a similarly structured sample for the HEE margin, again using initial scores as the forcing variable, but only looking at the first year because there was a lot of persistence in these highly effective ratings, and there were only about 100 teachers who received their first HE rating in the subsequent year. We didn't want to conflate the effects across years with the fact that this was just such a almost negligibly small sample. Okay, the specification is going to be familiar to everyone. Conditional on the forcing variable and other observables. We're looking for a jump in the outcomes. We're going to show you graphical evidence, which I think is nice for face validity. And then one of the interesting things about RD design is I think the standard practice around this seems to have cohered quite a bit in recent years. And so we're trying to be consistent with that. We'll show you parametric estimates, or I'll discuss them, that condition on different sets of controls. We allow the assignment variable to have different slopes above and below the threshold. And we've got this whole suite of robustness checks that I can get to in the discussion if you're interested. Density test for manipulation, what happens when you reduce the bandwidth or change the functional form. Do you see covariate balance around the threshold? What about placebo RDs? Do you have null results for other thresholds that don't have relevance? And so there's a body of literature suggesting that's good practice. There are other issues that are unique to this setting. One is, what if teachers who are under threat or have a strong incentive move across schools to try to gain a reward? What if principals know someone is under threat and might give them bias rating? And what about the cheating scandal we've heard about? So those are all things we can discuss. But here's the basic result for the first stage. For minimally effective teachers in the first year, we've got a fuzzy RD, so around 20% of teachers effectively appealed their initial ME rating. In the second year, it's almost virtually sharp. There were only 3 teachers who successfully appealed an ME rating. And again, those teachers are defined in the treatment group because we have this intent to treat analysis. The highly effective RD is fully sharp. Okay? So what do we see in outcomes? Let me sketch this out. For retention in the first year, it looks as if the teachers under threat were less likely to return, but that point estimate, though negative, is not statistically significant. In the second year, again, when the ME threat was arguably much more credible, school fixed effects. And again, is 80% retention at this threshold, so 20% are leaving, so an 11 percentage point change is a jump of more than 50%. And on the highly effective side, in terms of retention, some suggestion of a positive effect, but it's not statistically significant. And one of the things to note here, and this excited the district particularly, is just the positive slope here. that higher performing teachers were much more likely to be retained. And so it's like 90% in this range. So we don't find an effect there, though in some sense it might be a pushing a string phenomenon where there's just less leverage to move that. Okay, on subsequent performance, for minimally effective teachers who then returned in the next year, pretty tight null. There's no change in performance at that threshold. In the second year, when this incentive seemed more credible, we see a jump of around 12.6 impact points, even with all our conditioning that goes on. And you can see that in this graph. To put this in perspective, it's about a quarter of a teacher level standard deviation. It's equivalent to moving a teacher from the 10th to the 15th percentile. It's also equivalent to about 50% of the gain that novice teachers experience over their first few years in the classroom. And on the right tail of the distribution, among highly effective teachers, we see a similarly sized jump. Though this is one of the results we find is sensitive to bandwidth restrictions, and you can kind of see that here. If you were to start to tighten the bandwidth, this would look like a positive effect, but it drops in magnitude and becomes statistically insignificant there. Okay, so a little bit about robustness checks, and then I'll shut up because I'm out of time. So the causal warrant of the RD generally appears strong in terms of density tests, all the other things I described, with that caveat about the highly effective result. We don't find any evidence that non-random teacher mobility or two different teaching groups is a problem. We run auxiliary regressions that make those the dependent variable, and we don't see the incentive appearing to influence switching groups or switching schools. What about the cheating scandal? There were allegations of broad test manipulation in DC, but they actually precede our study window. In our study window, there was unusually high test security, and that test security identified a few teachers who had suspiciously high wrong to right erasures, but in such a small group, unsurprisingly, omitting them doesn't change our results. And the other thing, again, to underscore is that test scores weren't really the main focus of this for most teachers. And we see test score gains on those non-impact components. So how about rater bias? Well, again, raters are likely to know a teacher has strong incentives. Could that influence the scores they provide? Well, we argue that that doesn't appear to be the case. I mean, one thing to note, first of all, is we see gains for the subset of teachers who have IDA scores, which we don't think were necessarily manipulated over this period. But the other thing to note is some of the heterogeneity. If the raters were biased, we might expect to see those minimally effective teachers gaining on the commitment to school community and the task scores, which the district people said was where there was a lot of scope for principals to have autonomy, rather than just the gains on the classroom observation rubric and the core professionalism. But we don't see threatened teachers gaining on those things the principals really had a lot of control over. And also the TLF gains for those ME teachers were similar for when rated by the principal versus rated by the master educator. So really all sort of suggesting that rater bias isn't really an issue with these results. And we have a similar story for the highly effective teachers. There were big gains in TLF that were similar by rating type, and there was no change for them on the core professionalism measure, even though a small but non-trivial part of them actually got those points. Okay, so let me try to sum up, and I apologize for running over a little bit. We've got evidence that a performance assessment system, a really unique one with high-powered incentives, appears to meaningfully influence both teacher retention and to some extent subsequent performance. Remember, this is an analysis of extant teachers. And one of the concerns that people like Jesse Rothstein have raised is that, well, if you start firing teachers like this, you might have negative selection into the teacher pool. But apropos of the paper we just heard, I mean, what we're observing is that the impact performance of new hires clearly exceeds that of the leavers. So we don't necessarily have any general equilibrium caveats about what this is doing to the teacher workforce. What about external validity issues? Well, people always say, these RD estimates are local to the threshold, and that's a real concern here. Like if you're in the middle of the effective band, this whole system might be completely irrelevant to you as a teacher. And so we acknowledge that and stress that the RD estimate is really kind of a proof of concept around these incentives. So if people are interested, there's new scholarship around how to do RD inference causally away from the threshold, and we've been trying that with these data and are getting some encouraging results. Another external validity issue is this is the DC labor market. I mean, I was really struck by how many teachers apply and how few get hired and the process they're put through.
DCPS can do that because they're in DC, but if you're in some small rural area, you might not have the same leverage in terms of shaping your teacher workforce. And we haven't discussed at all cost effectiveness issues, which might come up in discussion. But again, the broad point here is, in terms of possible lessons for other districts, a seemingly compelling proof point for this type of human capital strategy, but also we really underscore in the paper there are important lessons around design and implementation that I think anyone interested in replicating this wants to bear in mind. Targeting multiple measures, clear communication of expectations, careful rater training, having good data systems, and having policy credibility and leadership buy-in. And just as a final point, I don't want to seem too cynical about this, but I sometimes wonder as I look at the landscape of other states and districts piloting this sort of thing, if the DC experience might be a kind of proof of concept that goes wholly unreplicated. Because as I scan that landscape, I don't necessarily see the same sort of leadership buy-in and careful attention to implementation detail that characterize this experience. And again, this is totally anecdotal and I'd love to be proven wrong, but you sort of get the flavor of it might just be districts that have to or are getting federal grants to set up these systems, doing them in a more cosmetic way that isn't as thoughtful or as aggressive or as enduring. But that's one of those to be determined questions. Thank you. Thank you for letting me ask.